There are moments when the inside gets loud. Not one thing, everything at once. The future pressing in with its unresolved possibilities, the past surfacing with its unfinished business, the present demanding attention it hasn't earned yet. All of it occupying the same mental space simultaneously, competing for priority, none of it willing to wait its turn. When I'm in that state, the word that comes closest to describing it is chaos. A kind of internal storm, not violent exactly, but disorienting, dense, the kind of inner weather that makes it genuinely difficult to find the ground beneath it. I've developed a practice for this. I call it mindscaping. The name comes from the idea of the interior as a landscape, something with terrain, with weather systems, with regions that are calm and regions that are turbulent. And like any landscape, it can be tended. Not controlled in the sense of forcing it into a shape it isn't, but actively worked with, the way a gardener works with what's growing rather than against it. When I close my eyes and begin the practice, the first thing I do is simply take inventory. I let everything that's present surface without immediately trying to organize or resolve it. The emotions that are raw get acknowledged. The pressures of the present moment are given a brief, honest look. The mental chatter that's been running on a loop gets noticed rather than continued. This part takes practice. The instinct is either to push things down immediately or get pulled into one of the competing demands and follow it. Mindscaping requires a different relationship, the position of the observer rather than the participant. Something closer to, I see you, I know you're there, and I'm not going to be you right now. From that position, the actual work becomes possible. The raw emotions get space to be felt rather than managed at arm's length. When something has been dragging at me, a weight I've been carrying without fully acknowledging, I let it land. Briefly, consciously, with intention. Not to amplify it, but to complete the feeling rather than store it unfinished. And then the turn towards steady water. This is the image I return to at the center of the practice. Calm water. Not because calm is the goal exactly, but because it's a physical image of what the mind can actually find within itself. A quality of surface that reflects clearly rather than distorts. I breathe into it. I let the breath be the only thing for a moment. The in, the pause, the out. And I hold that image of steadiness until something in the body begins to match it. The future enters differently from this place. Rather than pressing in with anxiety, I can let it carry the quality of vision. Images of where I want to go, what I'm building toward, the things that are worth the difficulty of the present moment. Happy visions for the future held lightly rather than grasped at, a direction rather than a demand. Mindscaping isn't a solution to the chaos. The storm returns, it always does. What the practice builds over time is a more reliable ability to find the still point within it, a place you can return to that exists independent of what's happening around and inside you. The I at the center of the personal weather system. It takes time, it takes repetition, it takes the intention to keep showing up to the practice even when the interior noise is loudest, and the practice seems most difficult. But with enough of both, the landscape becomes more familiar, and the path back to steady water becomes shorter each time. So here's what I find myself wondering. When the internal storm arrives and everything is competing for space at once, what is the one thing, image, breath, word, sensation that you've found has the most power to bring you back to ground?
But before the mindscaping can begin, there's usually a storm to contend with. And I've started to think the storm deserves more attention than it typically gets. We tend to treat internal chaos as the problem, the thing to move through as quickly as possible, the noise to quiet, the disruption to the preferred state of calm. But the more I've sat with it, the more I've come to believe the storm is doing something. It arrived for a reason, and understanding that reason changes how you relate to it. What is the internal storm actually made of? When I look closely, when I resist the urge to either suppress it or be swept away by it, I find it's rarely one thing. It's a convergence. Several things arriving at the same time from different directions. A worry about the future that has been building quietly. An emotion from earlier in the day that didn't get fully processed. A tension in a relationship that was set aside rather than resolved. A physical state, tiredness, hunger, the body's own signals, adding pressure to everything else. The storm is the result of multiple weather systems meeting in the same space, each one individually manageable, together at volume disorienting. There's also a threshold effect worth naming. The chaos doesn't usually announce itself gradually. It accumulates below awareness and then surfaces all at once, often triggered by something small, something seemingly disproportionate to the intensity of the response. Because the small thing didn't cause the storm, it just arrived at the moment when the accumulated pressure had nowhere left to go. The cup was already full. It just needed one more drop. What the storm is trying to do, I think, is get processed. The accumulated material, the feelings that were set aside, the tensions that were managed rather than addressed, the background anxieties that ran unchecked, all of it is asking for attention. The chaos is the system signaling overload. It's not a malfunction, it's a communication. Understanding this changes the relationship to it. When the storm arrives, the first useful question is no longer, how do I make this stop? It's, what has been building that I haven't been paying attention to? What accumulated unnoticed until it became impossible to ignore? What is the pressure actually made of? I found that the storm tends to lose some of its intensity the moment it's acknowledged with that kind of honesty. Not fully. The turbulence is real, and it takes time to move through, but something shifts when you stop fighting it and start listening to it instead. The chaos becomes slightly more legible. The components begin to separate from each other. The one worry becomes distinguishable from the other worry. The emotion from this morning becomes distinguishable from the background tension that has been running for weeks. This is the threshold between the storm and the still, the moment before the mindscaping begins, where you've turned toward the chaos rather than away from it, looked at it honestly enough to see what it's made of, and created just enough space between yourself and it to begin working with it rather than simply being subject to it. The storm doesn't have to be defeated, it has to be understood. And understanding it, even partially, even imperfectly, is usually enough to begin moving through it. So here's what I'm sitting with. When you think about the last time the internal chaos arrived with full force, can you identify what was actually in it, the specific ingredients that converged to produce that particular storm? And is any of that material still unresolved?
There's a particular quality of light that enters the present moment when you know where you're going. It doesn't change the difficulty of what's in front of you. The same pressures are there, the same unresolved things, the same demands on your time and energy, but they sit differently in you when there's a direction underneath them, a vision of something worth moving toward. I've been thinking about why this works, why holding an image of where you're going changes the quality of being where you are. Because it does, in a way that's more than just wishful thinking or motivational posturing. There's something deeper happening. The mind has a relationship with the future that is genuinely physical. When you hold a vivid, specific, emotionally present image of something you're building toward, not a vague wish, but a felt sense of that version of your life, the nervous system responds to it as partially real. We've explored this before. The way the brain doesn't always distinguish cleanly between what is vividly imagined and what is actually happening. A detailed vision of where you're going activates something. It orients the system. It gives the daily effort a context that makes it feel like movement rather than just expenditure. In the mindscaping practice, this is the turn toward what I call the happy vision. After the storm has been acknowledged, after the raw emotions have been given their moment, after the steady water has been found, the vision enters, and I hold it deliberately. The future I'm working toward, rendered as specifically as I can make it. Not a fantasy that floats above ordinary life, disconnected from the work required to reach it, but a living image of something real and possible, held with enough warmth and clarity that it produces an actual feeling in the body. What that feeling does is significant. It reframes the present. The difficulty is still there, but it becomes contextual, the price of admission to something worth having, rather than just an obstacle in an otherwise featureless terrain. The tension that was heavy becomes the productive tension of building. The effort that felt draining becomes the effort of moving towards something. There's a directional quality that positive projection creates, which I don't think can be replicated by any amount of present moment acceptance alone. Acceptance says, this is where you are, and it's okay. Vision says, this is where you're going, and it's worth it. Both are necessary. Together, they create something more complete than either does alone. The vision also has a clarifying effect on decisions. When you know what you're oriented toward, the options that move you closer become easier to identify, and the ones that move you further away become harder to rationalize. The vision acts as a filter, a reference point that the daily choices can be measured against, not rigidly, not as a source of judgment, just as a compass needle, quietly indicating direction. What I've found matters most about the vision isn't its precision or its ambition, it's the feeling it carries. The specific quality of aliveness that arises when you imagine that version of your life, the one where the work paid off, where the difficulty made sense in retrospect, where something you built exists in the world and you can feel its reality. Hold that feeling. Let it be present in the body. Let it be real enough that it can accompany you through the ordinary hours. The future doesn't have to wait to arrive before it starts doing its work. Held with enough clarity and enough warmth, it changes the texture of the present, right now, today, in whatever the day actually contains. So here's what I'm curious about. When you close your eyes and let the most honest version of your future self appear, the one who is living the life that this effort is building toward, what do you see? And how long has it been since you let yourself fully feel the reality of that image?
Nobody stays centered. This is the thing that took me the longest to actually accept. That the goal was never to arrive at some stable state of inner calm and remain there permanently. The goal was always something more dynamic than that. Something that requires more of you in a different way than staying ever could. The practice is the returning, not the staying. The returning. Because the drift is inevitable. The storm arrives. The chaos reassembles, the future visions fade under the pressure of an ordinary afternoon, the steady water gets disturbed. This is the nature of the interior life. It moves, it shifts, it generates weather that nobody ordered and nobody can entirely prevent. The question was never how to stop it from moving. The question is how quickly you can find your way back when it does. Every time you return, every single time you notice you've been pulled out of center and make the choice to come back, something is deposited. Not in any dramatic or visible way, quietly. The way a path gets worn into the ground not by a single footfall, but by thousands of them over time. Each one deepening the groove slightly, until one day the path is unmistakable even in the dark. That's what the practice of return builds, a groove. A neural pathway back to the place you keep going back to. And the more worn that path becomes, the more automatic the return starts to feel. The drift still happens, but the distance traveled before you notice it happening gets shorter, and the time required to find your way back gets less. What I've found is that the return doesn't have to be elaborate to count. It doesn't require a full mindscaping session, a long meditation, a perfect set of conditions. Sometimes it's a single breath taken with intention. Sometimes it's a moment of closing the eyes and placing the attention on the steady water, even briefly, even imperfectly. Sometimes it's just the noticing, the recognition that you've drifted, that the chaos has reassembled, that you're somewhere other than center, and the simple decision to move back. The decision itself is the return. The action follows from it. This is why the number of returns matters more than the length of any single arrival. 100 small returns in a day are worth more in terms of what they build than one long arrival that never has to be repeated. The practice is the repetition. The muscle is built by the returning, not by the holding. There's something else worth naming about what consistent return produces over time. It builds a certain kind of trust. Not confidence exactly, more like the quiet knowledge that you know how to find your way back. That no matter how far the storm takes you, the path home exists, and you've walked it enough times to know its shape in the dark. That the chaos, however intense, is not permanent because you have a practice that moves you through it, and you've proven that to yourself repeatedly across enough difficult days that the proof has weight. This is the long return from the practice of mindscaping. Not a state achieved, a relationship built with your own interior, with the center that was always there, even when the weather made it hard to find, even when the noise was loudest, even then. So here's what I'm sitting with. When you think about your own practice of return, whatever form it takes, how many times have you come back from the drift this week? And do you give yourself credit for each one of those small returns, or only for the days when you never seemed to drift at all?
There's a part of you that is watching this right now. Not thinking about it, watching it. The part that notices when your attention drifts. The part that registered a few moments ago that you were listening. The part that is always, in some sense, one step removed from whatever is happening. The part that can look at a thought rather than simply being inside it. This is the observer, and it may be the most useful thing you can develop. In the context of mindscaping, and really in the context of any inner practice, the observer is what makes everything else possible. Without it, you're not practicing presence or return or watching the storm. You're just inside the storm, moved by it, carrying it through the day without any distance between you and what it's doing to you. The observer is the gap, the small but essential space between the experience and the one who is having it. What the observer position actually feels like is something I've struggled to describe in language because language tends to make it sound more abstract than it is. It's not a detachment. It's not the cold remove of someone who has stopped feeling things. It's more like standing at the edge of the water instead of being underwater. You can see the current, you can feel the temperature, you can understand the force of it, but you're not being pulled along by it. You're present to it without being subject to it. When the internal storm arrives, when the chaos of competing emotions and pressures and thoughts converges, the observer is what allows you to ask, what is actually happening here, rather than simply becoming the answer to that question. Building the observer is a practice in itself, and it's more concrete than it might sound. The simplest version is this. When you notice a strong emotion or thought arising, instead of immediately following it or pushing it away, you name it. Quietly, internally, with no judgment. Anxiety is here. Frustration is present. That familiar worry has arrived again. The act of naming creates the gap, because to name something, you have to step back from it far enough to see what it is. You can't label the wave while you're underwater. The naming places you at the edge. Over time, with repetition, the observer position becomes more available, and more quickly available when you need it most. The gap doesn't have to be constructed laboriously in the middle of the storm anymore. It's simply there, a posture the mind has learned to assume, not because the emotions have become less real or less intense, but because your relationship to them has shifted,
from identification to observation. There's a distinction I find worth sitting with here. The observer doesn't arrive to analyze or fix or improve. Its role is much simpler and much rarer than any of those things. It arrives to witness, to see clearly what's actually present without immediately doing something about it. And that quality of clear seeing without the urgency to change or resolve is itself a kind of action. It metabolizes. It allows the emotion to complete its arc rather than being interrupted mid-process by the intervention of a mind that can't tolerate the feeling lasting one more second. The observer is how you stay in the room with difficult things long enough for them to tell you what they actually are. It's how the mindscaping becomes more than management, how the practice goes deep rather than staying at the surface. So here's what I find myself wondering. When you're in the middle of a strong emotion or a chaotic internal moment, can you locate the part of you that is watching it? And if you can, even briefly, even imperfectly, what does the view from there feel like compared to being inside it?
We have a complicated relationship with rest. On the surface, most people would say they want more of it. And yet, when it actually arrives, a free afternoon, an unscheduled hour, a stretch of time with nothing demanding to fill it, something in us tends to become uncomfortable. The impulse to fill it arrives almost immediately, to produce something, consume something, at minimum, scroll through something. The emptiness has an edge to it that most of us have been conditioned to move away from rather than into. But I've come to think that genuine rest, the kind that actually restores, is not the absence of practice. It's one of the most demanding practices available. And in the context of mindscaping, it might be the one we most consistently underuse. There's a distinction worth making between two kinds of rest. The first is collapse, the rest that happens when the system has been run too hard and simply gives out. The body on the couch after an exhausting week, the mind finally quiet not because it chose to be, but because it has nothing left to run on. This is real rest in the sense that recovery is occurring, but it's passive, reactive, the rest of depletion rather than intention. The second kind is different. It's rest chosen deliberately, before the depletion, in the middle of a functional day, not because there's nothing left, but because replenishment is a practice that requires regular input rather than emergency application. This is the rest that builds something, rather than just restoring what was lost. In mindscaping, intentional rest is its own form of tending the inner landscape. After the storm has been acknowledged, after the observer has taken its position, after the return to center has been made, sometimes what the landscape needs next isn't more active work. It needs to be left alone for a moment, to settle, the way disturbed water settles only when you stop stirring it. What intentional rest actually looks like is different for everyone, and I think this is worth saying clearly. It isn't always horizontal. It isn't always silence. For some people, it's a walk with no destination and no podcast. For others, it's music that asks nothing of them. For others, it's the particular quality of being in a body of water, the temperature change, the suspension, the way the world simplifies down to one physical sensation at a time. The common quality across all of these is that the mind is not being asked to produce, solve, perform, or manage. It's being given permission to simply be present without agenda. This sounds obvious. In practice, it's surprisingly rare, because even activities we label as rest, watching something, reading something, listening to something, are often still inputs that the mind is processing, evaluating, relating to. Genuine rest in this sense is closer to receptivity, the open field rather than the cultivated garden, available rather than directed. What the practice of intentional rest builds over time is a capacity for presence that active effort alone can't develop. The deepest processing often happens not in the moment of focused attention, but in the recovery that follows. The insight arrives in the shower, on the walk, in the quiet after the intense work period, not because of the rest, but because of it.
The subconscious continues what the conscious mind began, but it needs the conscious mind to step aside to do it. Rest is the space in which the work integrates. Without it, the mindscaping remains at the surface, technique without depth, effort without absorption. With it, the mindscaping becomes something more than a set of tools. It becomes a way of inhabiting your own interior. So here's what I find myself wondering. When you think about the quality of rest you actually give yourself, not the collapsed exhaustion kind, but the chosen, intentional kind, how often does it arrive? And do you treat it as something you earn or something you practice?
Progress in inner work doesn't tend to announce itself. There's no notification, no visible milestone, no moment where you wake up and find the interior landscape transformed into something obviously better than it was before. The changes come quietly, sideways, in ways you often only recognize in retrospect, and sometimes only when someone else points them out, or when you encounter a situation that used to level you and notice, almost with surprise, that it didn't. This is one of the more disorienting things about consistent inner practice. You do the work, you return to center again and again. You tend the landscape with intention, and for a long time it can seem like nothing is changing at all. The storms still arrive, the chaos still assembles, the drift still happens. And the mind, which tends to evaluate progress by comparing how things feel now to how they felt at the worst moments, sometimes concludes that all the effort has produced nothing. It hasn't. What's been building is just harder to see than what's been practiced. The first sign, when I look back, is usually a change in recovery time. Not the absence of the storm, the speed of return afterward. The difficult feeling that used to occupy 3 days now occupies 3 hours. The spiral that once ran for a week burns itself out by evening. The drift still happens, but the path back to center is so worn by now that the feet find it almost automatically. This is the landscape changing, not the weather, the terrain. The second sign is a shift in the relationship to the difficult thing. At the beginning of a practice, equanimity feels like something you have to construct in the moment, assembled deliberately, maintained effortfully, available only when conditions cooperate. Over time, it starts to feel less like something you do and more like something you have, a ground rather than a technique. The storms are still real, but they arrive on a surface that has more capacity to absorb them without being transformed by them. The third sign is subtler, a widening of the window between trigger and reaction. The thing that used to produce an immediate spike of feeling now produces a moment of recognition first. You notice you're being triggered before the behavior that used to follow automatically. That gap, however small, is the observer becoming structural, no longer something you have to step into consciously, present by default. What I want to say about all of this is that the changes don't make you someone different. They make you more fully yourself. The mindscaping practice doesn't install new qualities. It clears the ground for the qualities that were always there to become more consistently available. The steadiness that exists in the eye of the storm was always yours. The observer was always there. The path back to center was always there. The practice simply makes them easier to find and more reliable once found. There's a particular moment that tends to arrive somewhere in the middle of this kind of work, and when it does, you know something real has shifted. It's the moment when you catch yourself handling something difficult with a quality of presence that the version of you from 2 years ago couldn't have managed. And the recognition isn't triumphant. It's quieter than that. Something closer to, oh, so this is what has been building. That moment is the landscape showing you what it has become. Quietly, without fanfare, the way things grow underground first, invisibly before anything appears above the surface. So here's what I find myself wondering. When you think back over the last year or two of your own inner life, can you identify something that used to destabilize you that doesn't anymore? And do you know what changed, or did the change happen so quietly you almost missed it?
The body has been part of this the whole time. Even when the practice felt entirely mental, the quiet observation, the naming, the return to steady water, the body was there, holding the weather of the interior in its own way, in its tension, in its breath, in the particular quality of weight that settles into the shoulders when something is being carried that hasn't been put down. I used to think of mindscaping as primarily a practice of the mind, and in one sense it is. But the more I've paid attention, the more I've found that the body isn't just the vessel the mind happens to operate inside. It's part of the instrument. It holds things the mind has moved past. It registers things the mind hasn't yet noticed. And in many cases, it knows the weather before the thought about the weather arrives. Somatic awareness, which is simply the practice of paying deliberate attention to what the body is doing and feeling, adds a dimension to mindscaping that purely cognitive observation misses. Because the body speaks a different language than the mind. It doesn't narrate. It doesn't explain. It holds. A tightness in the chest that has been present for 3 days before you registered it consciously. A quality of restlessness in the legs when something unresolved is being avoided. The particular stillness that settles into the body when something is genuinely right, a decision made, a direction clarified, the inner landscape briefly aligned. Learning to read these signals adds an entirely new layer of information to the practice. And sometimes the body's signal is the more honest one. The mind can rationalize. It can construct a convincing narrative about why everything is fine when everything isn't fine. The body rarely bothers with the story. It just holds what's true. In the context of the storm we explored earlier, the body is usually where the storm registers first. Before the chaotic thought loop begins, before the competing pressures converge into something overwhelming, there's often a physical signal. A constriction somewhere, a change in the quality of the breath, a weight that arrived during sleep and was still there in the morning. Learning to catch the storm at the body level before it fully assembles in the mind creates the possibility of a very early return, the quietest, most effective version of the practice. What this looks like concretely is a simple shift in the direction of attention during mindscaping. Rather than moving immediately to the thoughts and emotions, the mental content, spending a few moments first with the body, scanning slowly, without judgment or the desire to fix anything, just noticing where tension is being held, where the breath is shallow, where something feels constricted or heavy or off, naming it as you would name an emotion, bringing the observer position downward into the physical. And then, this is the part that changed the practice for me, breathing into those places rather than past them, not forcing anything to release, just offering the body the signal that you've noticed what it's holding, that you're here, that it doesn't have to carry the weight alone. The response is often immediate and surprising. Something softens. The breath deepens on its own. The held thing doesn't disappear, but its density changes. It becomes something you're with rather than something you're under. The body and the mind are one landscape. The weather moves through both. And the mindscaping that attends to both, that brings the same quality of witnessing attention to the physical as to the mental, becomes something more complete, more integrated, more capable of reaching the places where the storm actually lives. So here's what I'm sitting with. Right now, in this moment, without changing anything, what is your body holding that your mind hasn't quite gotten around to acknowledging yet?
If I had to name what the practice has been building toward, across all of this, the mindscaping, the observer, the storm and the still, the return, the rest, the body, the slow, visible changes in the landscape, I would say it's been building toward a particular kind of relationship. Not with anything outside, with the interior itself. A tended interior isn't a perfect interior. That's the first thing worth saying clearly. It still has its difficult weather. The storms still arrive, the drift still happens, the unresolved material still surfaces at inconvenient moments asking to be met. None of the practice eliminates any of that. What it changes is the quality of inhabiting it. I've been trying to find the right word for what a tended interior actually feels like from the inside. The closest I've come is livable. Not always comfortable, not always easy, but livable in the way that a space is livable when it's been tended, when there's a degree of order beneath the surface, when the basic systems work, when you know where things are and what they mean, and how to move through the space without being constantly surprised by your own floor plan. That quality of familiarity with your own interior, the knowledge that comes from having spent real intentional time there, changes everything downstream. Decisions feel different when they're made from a place that has been listened to rather than constantly overridden. Relationships feel different when you're bringing a more honestly known version of yourself to them. Even the difficult days feel different, not lighter exactly, but less disorienting, because you've been in difficult weather before, and you know, with the weight of accumulated evidence, that the path back to center exists and you can find it. There's a word that I keep returning to when I think about what the practice produces over time: coherence. A quality of alignment between what you feel, what you think, what you say, and what you do. Not perfect alignment, that's not available to human beings, but a closer relationship between the layers than most people manage to sustain. The tended interior is more coherent than the untended one, and coherence produces a kind of integrity, in the structural sense of the word, that makes everything built on top of it more stable. What I've found across all the practice is that the most reliable predictor of how I'll handle what's coming is the quality of my relationship with my own interior right now. How honestly I'm seeing what's there. How reliably I can find the still point when the weather gets difficult. How much of the unresolved has been met rather than accumulated. The interior is the ground everything else grows from. Tend it, and what grows has a better chance of being what you actually intended to grow. There's something I want to say directly before we close this series. This kind of practice is not urgent. It doesn't produce results in a week or a visible transformation in a month. It produces something slower and more durable than that, a gradual shift in the quality of your own company. The interior becomes a place you can actually inhabit, rather than a space you're perpetually trying to escape from, manage from a distance, or drown out with noise. That shift is quiet. It rarely gets the credit it deserves, but I believe it is the work, the real work, underneath everything else, the practice that makes all the other practices possible. So here's what I find myself sitting with at the end of all of this. What would it feel like to genuinely come home to your own interior, to inhabit it fully, honestly, without the urge to escape it? And how far away does that feel from where you are right now?